Another From Software game, another reason to argue about easy modes. The upcoming release of Elden Ring shows that the necessity of easier difficulty settings in video games is still a major debate among many players, and it's one that probably won't be ending anytime soon. From Software's games have been defined by their higher than average difficulty ever since the first Dark Souls used the phrase "prepare to die" as the tagline of its marketing campaign, and Elden Ring is set to continue the trend of From Software games lacking difficulty options. To a degree, this is understandable. After all, the Dark Souls series and its successors have been hugely successful both critically and commercially. From the perspective of the dedicated fans sharing endless "get good" memes, the addition of an easy mode just isn't necessary. If players cannot handle the difficulty, then they should go play a different game. As a result, From Software's games remain relatively divisive for players who find their default difficulty levels more frustrating than engaging. Many articles advocating for an easy mode in From Software games argue that difficulty options would reduce this divisiveness by making them more accessible to a wider audience without taking away the challenge that fans have come to love. From that point of view, adding difficulty options seems like an easy choice. So why has From Software continued to offer only a single difficulty setting, even in their newer titles? One explanation is that their games are intended to provide an experience that can only be achieved when players are forced to get good in order to proceed. But is it worth preserving this experience if it's only available to a fraction of dedicated players? By considering why From Software's games are deliberately difficult and examining how that difficulty affects a player's experience, perhaps we can finally close out the debate. Should Elden Ring have an easy mode? To understand why From Software's games have cultivated and maintained a reputation for high difficulty, it makes sense to start at the beginning of their success with Demon's Souls. Released in 2009, Demon's Souls contained many of the gameplay elements that would go on to define From Software's most popular titles in the next decade. The game included the ability for players to leave messages that provide advice to others, a unique multiplayer system that allowed players to summon allies and invade others, and a mechanic called Bloodstains that would replay the final moments of dead players. The implementation of the Bloodstain system in particular makes it clear that dying was an intrinsic element of Demon's Souls' design. Signs of your own deaths, as well as those of other players, litter each level as a reminder that danger lurks around every corner. But Demon's Souls was clearly not just hard for the sake of being hard, as its other unique systems, its messages and cooperative summoning, would not have been nearly as useful if players did not feel seriously threatened by the challenges that they faced. Considered as a whole, the systems that From Software's later games would adapt from Demon's Souls served to give each game's difficulty additional meaning. The messages and Bloodstains acted as a constant reminder that players were not taking on these challenging levels alone, and the cooperative summoning offered a chance to overcome those challenges together. In an interview from 2010, Demon's Souls director Hidetaka Miyazaki pointed to the memory of a snowy night as the inspiration for the game's unique multiplayer systems. The origin of that idea is actually due to a personal experience where a car suddenly stopped on a hillside after some heavy snow and started to slip. The car following me also got stuck, and then the one behind it spontaneously bumped into it and started pushing it up the hill. That's it. That's how everyone can get home. Then it was my turn, and everyone started pushing my car up the hill, and I managed to get home safely. You could probably call it a connection of mutual assistance between transient people. Oddly, that incident will probably linger in my heart for a long time. Simply because it's fleeting, I think it stays with you a lot longer. Because Demon's Souls is a game with a lot of dying in it, surely that kind of fleeting cooperation should come out of all the death. We're all dead, so let's help each other out. The multiplayer systems that were undeniably Demon's Souls' most innovative feature are closely related to its most infamous feature, the difficulty. These multiplayer mechanics and message systems appeared again in the Dark Souls series, as well as Bloodborne and Sekiro in some capacity, demonstrating From Software's commitment to making games that are not hard simply for the sake of being hard. Instead, the challenges in each game push struggling players to interact with one another, and the sense of accomplishment that follows overcoming each challenge makes those interactions all the more memorable. This interview with Miyazaki shows us that From Software's games are deliberately hard, so as to encourage players to behave in a certain way. By encouraging the kinds of mutual assistance between transient people that Miyazaki's story was about, Demon's Souls acts as a powerful example of how even the most daunting challenges can be overcome through cooperation and mutual support. Rather than simply telling players this message through dialogue and narration, Demon's Souls is able to show players the value of working together through its difficult gameplay. This practice of using a game's systems to communicate a particular theme is an example of procedural rhetoric, a term coined by Ian Bogost, which refers to how video games can make arguments about the way the world works through rules that suggest a particular function of a particular system. In other words, the meaning of a video game as a cultural artifact comes from how effectively a game's programming can simulate a theme or philosophical idea in the world of the game. In the case of Demon's Souls, the decision to not include an easy mode to circumvent difficult sections of the game is a rule that encourages players to seek alternative methods of completing a challenge. For most players, those alternative methods are the game's unique multiplayer mechanics. In this way, Demon's Souls does not allow you to magically make things easier when the going gets tough, but it does allow you to reach out to help other people and receive that same help in return. The procedures of Demon's Souls as a piece of software thus serve as a metaphor for Miyazaki's story about the cars on the hill, demonstrating how high difficulty encourages players to engage with the game's unique multiplayer systems in ways that might have been overlooked if an easy mode had been available. Demon's Souls' high difficulty does not just influence the way players engage with its procedural systems. It also has an impact on the way players react to the world and characters that represent those procedural systems. In the words of Aubrey Annable, "We experience games as digital procedures, but our very access to their procedural expression is necessarily couched in and framed by the visual, oral, and narrative dimensions of the games. The opposite is also true. Our experience of a game's representations is always informed by the invisible digital procedures the game asks our bodies to make visible. In other words, the way players feel about elements like the music or story of a game are directly influenced by the gameplay associated with those elements. As a result, if a game's procedures are unable to reinforce the other elements of its fiction, the experience of playing the game will suffer. Take Alduin from Skyrim, for example. Described in-game with such grandiose titles as World Eater, Alduin is built up to be a godlike entity over the course of the game's story, which would lead one to believe that the final battle against him will be, in the parlance of 2011, truly epic. However, the Alduin that players actually fight is no different from the other dragons that the player has been fighting on a regular basis up to that point. The ease with which the player defeats Alduin undermines the narrative of the rest of the game by representing what should be a uniquely powerful character as one of hundreds of flying lizards. This disconnect between narrative and gameplay is something that Demon's Souls, and recent FromSoftware games more generally, mostly avoids when it comes to the dangers of its world. While there are some notable exceptions, most of the enemies players face are just as dangerous as they appear. It is easier to become invested in Boletaria or Lordran as a deadly and foreboding place, when death genuinely does lurk around every corner. From a gameplay perspective, it may be difficult to seriously entertain Alduin's godlike status, but anyone who's played Dark Souls 3 will likely agree that the Nameless King deserves his status as a god of war. In this way, the inability to avoid difficult parts of a game by lowering the difficulty helps to reinforce the fictions that give flavor to the gameplay, as the challenges the players face effectively represent the expectations set by the narrative. By considering how a game's difficulty can influence the way players interact with its mechanics and interpret its aesthetics, we can see that FromSoftware's decision to not include easy modes in their games serves to reinforce a particular experience of play. If players could choose to play on a lower difficulty from the beginning, or to circumvent challenging sections, they may never feel the tension that a powerful enemy is intended to instill, or the catharsis that follows a difficult encounter. Having difficulty options does give players more freedom to play each game in their own way, but some part of the experience will be compromised when a game must adapt to its player instead of the player adapting to the game. This need for adaptation is ultimately what has made FromSoftware's games resonate so strongly with players over the years. By building around a higher than average difficulty level, Demon's Souls and its successors have been able to push players outside of their comfort zones and provide experiences that they did not even know they wanted beforehand. Just as Miyazaki's story about the cars on the hill demonstrates, people can learn a lot about themselves and others when they must improvise a solution in the face of a difficult situation. So, Elden Ring does not need an easy mode because it would stop players from achieving gamer nirvana. End of story, right? Not quite. While pushing players to be the most MLG they can be does have its merits, it is important to remember that difficulty is relative, and different players can have very different experiences with the same challenge. For many people, an easy mode may be just as challenging as the default difficulty setting is for others, and including one could make a game more accessible. In reference to Dark Souls 3, David Thayer argues that an easy mode would allow more people to experience the game, and that's a good thing. Its exclusion is restrictive only. While his assertion that the lack of an easy mode is purely a restrictive decision does not hold up for the reasons discussed earlier, it would be a good thing if more people could enjoy FromSoftware's games. One important point to consider is that an easy mode would remove restrictions, not just for less skilled players, but also for players with disabilities. Some issues can be circumvented with specialized controllers, but for people like Helen Ashcroft, who has many symptoms of dyspraxia, the solutions are not so simple. If there's any kind of variable that means I can't memorize when to hit a certain button, and instead have to very quickly react to a constantly changing situation, I'll probably never manage it. My brain simply doesn't process information fast enough. This is why for me, an easy mode is essential. For Ashcroft and many players like her, it is simply not possible to get good enough to complete a game like Demon's Souls, and this is not a problem that can be resolved by measures outside of the game. Ashcroft's article also highlights the way that an easy mode can still be a struggle for some players. She is not seeking to avoid challenging games. Instead, she's only asking that challenges can be reasonably completed by anyone. This is a reasonable request, because it does not deny the value that difficulty can bring to gameplay, and instead it emphasizes how different players face different challenges. The difficulty debate has gone on for so long because at its core there is a conundrum. How can a game provide an appropriate challenge for players with different skills and abilities without also providing an easy way out for players who give up on challenges too quickly? While it is necessary to make games accessible to a wider audience, it is also important to maintain the tight relationship between a game's procedures and its aesthetics. Demon's Souls multiplayer systems are a great example of how mechanics meant to make a game easier can support the themes that the game is trying to convey. But the last decade of easy mode debates shows that these systems are not quite enough for many players. Elden Ring has gone a step further by introducing the ability to summon NPC allies in certain areas, and provides players with more freedom to explore, but it is still too early to judge how impactful these changes will be. One option for making a game accessible but still challenging would be to get creative with the implementation of an easy mode. Supergiant Games' Hades is a game all about the cycle of death and rebirth, and its version of an easy mode is designed to complement rather than circumvent frequent deaths. The God mode in Hades reduces the damage that the player takes and gradually increases in strength each time the player dies. As a result, all players will experience the same die and retry pattern that the game is designed around, but God mode players will receive an extra boost to help them along. A system resembling Hades' God mode would be a natural fit for a FromSoftware game, as it would reward persistence without allowing players to immediately brute force their way through the game. Perhaps players can acquire an item that provides a small health boost each time they respawn at the same checkpoint, kind of like the opposite of Dark Souls 2's hollowing mechanic. Such a system would reduce the frustration caused by repeated deaths, without eliminating the tension that comes from exploring a new area or facing a new boss. A solution like this may be the answer to calls for a conventional easy mode to be added to more games, as it serves to make the core experience of the game's procedures more accessible, rather than simply making the games easier. As a successor of the mechanics established in Demon's Souls, Elden Ring's narrative and world are intimately connected with its difficult gameplay, and to preserve the strength of this connection, the game should not simply add an easy mode. However, this is not to say that options to make the game more accessible to a wide audience would negatively affect the core experience. Implementing mechanics that reduce frustration, while still encouraging players to persevere against seemingly insurmountable odds, would strike a middle ground that can satisfy both sides of the difficulty debate. What exactly this middle ground should look like is up to FromSoftware to decide. but there are many games out there that take unconventional yet effective approaches to managing difficulty. Demon's Souls' unique multiplayer features developed in tandem with the game's punishing difficulty, suggesting that similarly innovative systems can be conceived if developers get creative with the way that they handle difficulty options. Crafting a gameplay experience that is tense and exacting, but also accessible to anyone willing to take on the challenge will not be easy. But then again, what is?